Scott, can the participants give comments on the while the webinar takes place? So you get it, or we get everything, or how does it work?
I'll be moderating the questions. People are happy to or welcome to send their questions in, and I'll see them, and then I'll direct them to each of you as they come in, and we're going to do the questions all at the end. So everyone will do all the presentations, and then we're going to do the questions at the end.
Scott, I forgot how to share my screen.
I will be sharing the access to that with you.
Oh, okay,
I'll be
great. Okay.
turning your screen sharing when it's your turn.
Good. Got it. Thanks.
Okay, so things are going, and welcome everybody who's just joining us here on the IWRA, International Water Resources Association webinar for World Toilet Day, which was yesterday, but we thought that no one would tune in on a Sunday, so we are waiting here till Monday to celebrate, and we have a lot of great speakers lined up for you here today, and we're going to be starting in just 1 or 2 minutes, and so I'd like to ask everyone to just be ready, and we will start with our first speaker in just a few minutes. So thank you for your time. All right, well, it's here at 3 minutes past, according to my clock, so that's giving anyone who runs a few minutes late a chance to catch up with us, and I think it's a good time for us to get started on our webinar. I'd like to start by thanking everyone who has attended and joined us here today. And thank you for coming, and this is, as you know, the World Toilet Day, which is an international worldwide event, and this is the International Water Resources Association, and so we are having a webinar to share many different insights from our members and people invited presentators on World Toilet Day and on sanitation issues more broadly in the ways that they not just affect maybe more practical on the ground, you know, piping and plumbing, but also ways that they affect our society, ways that they affect governance, and many different insights into these issues. So, as I said, this is a webinar hosted by the International Water Resources Association, and the IWRA is an international network of researchers and practitioners who work on multidisciplinary range of water resource issues. We're a nonprofit, non-governmental educational organization, and we provide a global knowledge-based forum really for bridging disciplines and geographies by connecting professionals, individuals, corporations, institutions, everyone who's concerned with the sustainable use of the world's water resources. And this, you know, webinar is kind of one of those things that we do, which kind of connects people from all over the world to share and think about the similar interests that we all have around water and its governance. So we're really happy to have you here today, and we have a great panel, both academics and practitioners, and people with a lot of years of experience and who are deeply researched in this year's theme around wastewater. This is one of the really sanitation and World Toilet Day, you know, an issue that's becoming increasingly important in our world. Whether we address this from, you know, human rights or other bigger pictures about implementing effective water governance, or from a practice where we're talking about the rubber meets the road and the actual you know, setting of standards and measures and how do we get everyone connected to the you know, sanitation. A lot of people all around the world have their, you know, eyes and their minds are being turned around towards issues of sanitation. So we're really happy to be able to bring you these speakers and to bring you these presenters. I know several of you have been interested in reading more about these issues, and what we've done is we've made one of the special issues from Water International, our flagship journal, available as an open access to all of you who have registered for the webinar. This was a special issue that I believe Dr. Saravan was the editor, and so I've included the details for that in your registration emails. One that was a reminder that was sent out to you earlier, and a follow-up that will come at the end of the webinar with all the how to log in and get the open access to the journal. So please take advantage of that. Our publisher, Taylor & Francis, has very nicely given that open access to everybody. So log in, download all the articles, and then cite them all, because I think that's what the the authors would like you to do. So take advantage of this. And so we would also like to continue this conversation about World Toilet Day, about water sanitation issues more broadly on our LinkedIn page after the event. So after we're finished, go ahead and feel free to follow us, search for us on LinkedIn, and we'll have a section set up, and you can give your thoughts and feedback and continue the conversation. So we have a really distinguished panel here with us today, and we're covering a lot of issues and case studies and some broader theoretical questions too. We have Halash Greski from the Institute for Work and Health in Switzerland. We have V.S. Saravan at the University of Bonn, Freya Mills from University of Technology in Australia, Sonia Loy at Texas A&M, and Gunilla Oberg at University of British Columbia in Canada. So just to briefly go over the format of today's webinar, you've tuned in before, it's just like the other ones. Each of our presentators are going to give a short PowerPoint, about 10 minutes long, and then at the end of that we'll have questions time with you. So if you have a question, you'll see on your GoToWebinar control panel, it's on the right side of my screen, probably on the right side of your screen too. Questions are down 2/3 of the way to the bottom. There's a little section. You can open that up, type in a question, I'll see it, and at the end of the webinar, I'll moderate the questions to each of our speakers. So please let me know if you have a question for the whole panel, or if it's a question very specifically for one speaker. It'd be great if your questions were of a general interest to everyone instead of a small, narrow question with each of the speakers. If you have a very technical question, feel free to reach out to our speakers. You can find them all on the internet and send them an email at their work address, and I'm sure that they'll be willing to get in touch with you about any of their details on their presentations. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn this over to Alaska for your presentation. Let me share the screen.
Show my screen. Okay.
There we go. That looks great.
We got it? Okay.
Looks beautiful.
And you can hear me?
Mm-hmm. Sounds great.
Okay, let me do this though. Okay, so hello everyone. Thanks for joining us, and thanks Scott for that nice introduction. So it's true that today I will give a presentation about one of the areas that's not always talked about when we talk about water and sanitation, and that's because it concerns water, sanitation, and hygiene at the workplace. So we're going to talk about how healthy workers can make healthy communities, and how we can use some of ILO, which is the International Labor Organization's principles on occupational safety and health to promote safe access to wash at the workplace. So we start off with work. Some of us love it, some of us hate it, but the truth is that a lot of us don't really have a choice, and we are forced to spend a lot of time in the workplace in order to establish our own security. And that's something that links all of us. We spend approximately 1/3 of our working lives, of our adult working lives, in the workplace. And exposures that happen at the workplace have a lot to do with how healthy our communities are. We have take-home exposures where we're exposed to things at work that we can later bring home to our families. In some cases, people live where they work, so they're sharing common facilities in regards to sanitation. So there's a lot of overlap, and often we tend to overlook these situations. So all elements of water, sanitation, and hygiene are very vital for our working lives. So if we can imagine a situation where at the workplace you have contaminated water or lack of access to safe water, you can very quickly have situations where people fall ill, they become dehydrated, and then they could also die from some of the transmissible diseases. The ILO reports that every 15 seconds a worker dies from some kind of disease or accidents that related to an exposure at the workplace. So this is a big issue. This is a global issue that we need to pay more attention to. And in regards to the that happen at the workplace because of different exposures. We also have another side. We have a productivity side, an economical side that we need to think about, that not having access to safe water and safe sanitation can reduce worker productivity and can have a severe impact on businesses' production. So because of all these reasons, the International Labor Organization has developed a whole array of labor standards and instruments to guide how workers, employers, and governments can really take control of the situation. So they've developed labor standards and instruments for 5 different areas related to WASH. That includes drinking water, washstands and showers, sanitary conveniences such as toilets, protective equipment and facilities, and also for refuse and disposal. So one of the most important conventions by the ILO when it comes to health at the workplace is the Convention number 155. And this convention seeks to define work. It seeks to define health at work specifically by saying that health is not just something that happens at the workplace. Health is broader. It should be defined also as community health. So in a situation such as this that you see, this is a mining camp, where you see the mining camp is very close to the household. So you can have exposures that happen at work and are brought back into the house. So with this convention, the ILO really wanted to show this important overlap between work and life. So because we're celebrating today World Toilet Day in regards to sanitation all around the world, I'll just share with you some of the provisions that the International Labor Organization makes for sanitation at the workplace. So they spell these things out in their instruments, and they say that in all workplaces there must be a sufficient number to meet the demands of all the workers. They should be gender separated in order to ensure privacy. They should be culturally appropriate based on where in the world they're located. And very important in regards to the spread of disease, they should be improved. So based on the UN definition of improved sanitation. They should also be accessible. Oh, okay. They should also be accessible to all workers in regards to any kind of disabilities that may be present. They should be in a good location, so a location that's accessible in regards to distances. So if we're thinking about people that are working in agriculture and they may be very far away from locations. So it has to be a consideration when the workplace is planned out. They should be comfortable, so they should be ventilated, they should be kept clean. And finally, not only should the actual place be there for sanitation, but employers must also provide adequate breaks. And this should be based on different workers' needs. So not just one type of break for all workers, but we should take into consideration, for example, vulnerable populations like pregnant women. Now, one point that I think we don't talk about enough in WASH is menstrual hygiene management. So women represent nearly half of the global labor market. They're a significant and growing portion of the world's employment. But there's still so many taboos around this area, and we're bringing this dialogue to the forefront. We need to also consider women's issues. And it's a big challenge for a lot of women working around the world. The ILO has done several case studies on reduced productivity for women that don't have adequate access to menstrual hygiene management. And it's really now it's time to take action for this. It's time to realize that this is a human rights issue. This is an issue of dignity, and we need to work together to really highlight some of these more taboo issues. So based on, I only showed you 2 quick case studies of some of the provisions that the ILO outlines, but there's an entire array of them. And because of this, last year the ILO decided to capture all of them together and create this self-training handbook. So this self-training handbook has 2 parts. It has a training guide that has separate modules on access to safe water, on access to hygiene, and on access to sanitation. And it also has a different section for action manuals. So these action manuals are designed specifically for workers, for governments, and for employers to be able to use this information and to implement it in the real life. So in the guidebook as well, you have different checklists where you can set priorities for your workplace and to make sure that all the needs of all the different types of workers there are met. So we've really developed a lot of literature on the problems that happen in the workplace in regards to WASH. They've been well documented. But now is really the time that we need to work in collaboration. Often we think that this is only the problem of the workers or the problem of the employers. But with this publication, the ILO sought to highlight the importance of collaboration between this tripartite dialogue. So there are many links as well between these three actors. And if we can work together concretely, we can make sure that we could prevent disease and also mortality at the workplace because of something as simple as access to safe water and sanitation. So the takeaway message I want to leave with you is that healthy workers make healthy communities. All around the world, workers are impacted by what they are exposed to at the workplace. They take this home to their families, they share this with this community, and in order to protect all of those vulnerable people in the community, we have to make sure that we put WASH at work first. So I invite everyone that's listening to get your free copy of the Self-Training Handbook. It's available on the ILO website. It has been recently translated to Arabic, and I believe it will be translated to many other languages very soon. So thank you very much. And I wanted to keep my time to under 10 minutes. I think I was pretty good at that.
I'm quite impressed, to be honest.
Yeah.
Not just with the presentation, but with the brevity and able to keep it right there at the time. That's first time it's ever happened. Thank you.
Very good. Well, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, I really do appreciate that presentation. It was really insightful, and I think it really highlighted some not just the work being done at the international level. So often we bring on a lot of academics and speak at our webinars, and they bring in a lot of insight, but this is a bit of an insight coming directly from an international organization that's setting the standards, that's pushing the agenda in a bit more of a tactile, tangible form. So I thought that was a really good presentation. And I also thought it was really good to get the gender aspect out of that too. That's, like you said, it's an issue, it's taboo, it's not discussed enough. But I think that also, we're having a lot of ground change, if nothing else, right now. And that hopefully going forward, younger researchers who maybe are pushing these issues harder than before. And I think we're also seeing at a national level, we're seeing a change in the gender balance of who's, right now we have, I think, 4-to-1, 4-to-2 if you count me, gender balance here, and that's great. And I think that's going to help bring these issues further up. So thanks for that presentation. It was really helpful. Our next presenter is Freya Mills. No, wait. It is V.S. Saravan at the University of Bonn. So I will turn it over to you, Doctor. Freya, you're after him. So.
Yeah.
There you go. That looks great.
But I can't see the video. Is it okay or?
No, it looks fine. You look great. I can see everything.
Okay, because I'm not able to see the video in my screen. So, yes, now I got it.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much, Scott, and also to the International Water Resource Association for having me here, and also bringing this World Water Day into the forum. My presentation will primarily focus on how national and international agencies fail to comprehend the problem of water sanitation and hygiene, and how they are shifting the blame on the communities. So that is my whole sort of a presentation I will try to make about it. For me, water sanitation hygiene represent a whole cycle where we try to source water, but the water is not always safe given the various deposits that is there, even if it is in various forms. But this water, it needs to be treated and then delivered in a safe form to the people or to various users. Once the water is used, it is a common sense that anyone who drinks water, 80% of it is supposed to be disposed. And this disposed water needs to be treated, and either it can be reused or it should be disposed of safely to the environment. And this is where the cycle remains. But unfortunately, we don't see this sort of a comprehensive understanding from the international, national and international agencies, especially in the last 3-4 decades. And also, they fail to show any commitment in addressing this problem. As you see, this, which I drew from the progress on the drinking water sanitation and hygiene, the joint monitoring panel report, the drinking water sanitation and hygiene are seen as 3 compartments and not in an interlinked manner. As you see this, the drinking water, 7 out of 10 people seem to have safely managed access to drinking water services. Now, let me make it very clear. When they say safely managed drinking water, it is the water that is sourced and considered to be safe without any fecal contamination, without any chemical contamination. And it is not clear as per this joint monitoring panel report that this water will be treated or will be treated in due course or not. Presuming that 7 out of 10 people use water, this 7 out of 7 people needs to be provided with adequate sanitation facilities. But that same sanitation facility is not carried on when we look at the sanitation target, where only 2 out of 5 people have safe access to sanitation services. And in recent years, they have also included hygiene. And what is interesting is that they have the indicator for hygiene is hand washing, and in contrast to hygiene as a more public health issue. And it is this compartmentalized approach which gets reflected when they try to address the Millennium Development Goals, or in recent years it is the Sustainable Development Goals. The Joint Monitoring Panel tries to highlight its links to various Sustainable Development Goal target. But what is interesting is they really fail to understand some of the goals that is there and which needs to be addressed. One is its links to the health. And in goal 3, ensuring healthy lives and promote well-being, there is a focus. It is targeted to reduce the number of death and illness from water pollution. And the second goal is 6.3, where it is to improve water quality. Interesting, the Joint Monitoring Panel or the national and international agencies fail to look at this water quality information itself and this and its link to it. And the last is this goal for building a resilient infrastructure. While to have a very good water sanitation and hygiene, we need an infrastructure, but unfortunately, the Sustainable Development Goals thinks infrastructure is more, here it is mentioned more to economic development and so on. So in essence, what we see, whether it is Millennium Development Goals or even the Sustainable Development Goals, many interventions are focused on on-site drinking water, on-site toilet construction, or washing hands as in hygiene practices. And these are seen as a very compartmentalized and independent activity rather than integrated way. So what is the result of this? Is on-site water supply resulting in poisoning and exposing millions to fluoride, nitrate, arsenic pathogens. And in recent years, we also find deposits of antibiotic resistance compounds. And on-site gleaming toilets is only drowning people in their own excreta, because many toilets are built without any connection to the drainage or a sewage connection. And in the process, we see outbreak of dengue, malaria, chikungunya, especially in countries like, in developing countries like India, Ghana, Brazil, Mexico, and so on, where the sewage networks are poorly, it's very old, aged, and they are poorly managed. And washing hands is seen as more of a practice rather than seeing hygiene in a more public health way. Now, my argument in this presentation is to focus on the national and international agencies to make provisions for an enabling environment where people can come, it will meet the demands of people for drinking water and adequate safe sanitation facilities. But there are, why I suggest is this: one, That is inadequate housing, namely in developing countries or in medium income countries. And I take two indicators for that, looking at how households live in the number of rooms a household live. And I'm taking two cases. One is from India and one is from Ghana. And in India, about 70% of the household live in two-room housing areas, and which is very inadequate given the scenario for building toilet. And it is also the similar case in Ghana, where it is even worse. But if you look at the space available for these households, the average living space per person available in India and Ghana, it's quite vastly different. In India, it is about per person, the space is about 100 square feet, whether it is urban or rural with marginal difference. In Ghana, it is about 50 square feet. In essence, many of the countries, the average living space per person is even much lower or about equivalent to a prison cell in US. And given the space available, it's impossible or very difficult for households to have toilets inside the house. And many times people have toilets 10 meters, 50 meters away, and going to toilets outside the house results in insecurity, especially for women and young girls, and who have been attacked and affected psychologically and sexually over a period of time in many parts of Africa and in South Asian countries. And very often we hear how women get raped and also sexually harassed by the community in the process. And second thing, indicator that I would like to bring is the infrastructure. And as you see, the state or the national, international agencies should commit itself to building adequate infrastructure in order to compensate the toilets in the house. But interestingly, many national and international agencies try to shrug off this responsibility. And as I'm quoting from one of the leading development agencies, the Department for International Development, the UK funding agencies, which says on-site sanitation are less costly and individual households can potentially contribute a greater share of investment. For them, urban sewerage system requires high level of capital expenditure for infrastructure. And it also says, the report goes on stating that their portfolio should target on those types of intervention that are most likely to achieve the MDGs, or in recent years it is SDGs. In fact, many national and international agencies are running behind these so-called development goals rather than offering a sustainability of these interventions. The third area which I really want to highlight broadly is on the socio-cultural factors, which is one of the biggest hampering factor in many of the developing countries. The values, norms, and beliefs. Many times in the Oriental society, there is a beliefs of whole purity and pollution. Even if the houses are big enough to have toilets on their own and also to build pit toilets in the house, because of the purity and pollution, the concept of purity and pollution, they don't want to have a toilet inside the house because a toilet is supposedly considered to be a waste, which is supposed to be outside the living space, and they don't like the smell of the toilets also. And the second thing that is part of the socio-cultural factors is hierarchy in society. And some of the things which Halshaka was pointing it out is the workers. Like in India, the society is very hierarchic, and the way the sewage is supposed to be managed, it involves a community hierarchy involved. The tradition, rituals, and practices are so hierarchic in this where it is difficult to break this hierarchy if we leave the responsibility to the communities or to the individuals. It is where the state has to come with several regulations and incentives. And the third area is of the social cultural factors, the gender roles. And in many developing countries, there is a clear-cut gender roles between male, female, and within females, there is roles between older women versus the younger girls, and how these traditions are worked out. And so these sort of socio-cultural factors hinders in having adequate sanitation and hygiene facilities if it is done in the current way to blame the people or victimize the people in this way. So in essence, my purpose call is to make the state or call for the national and international agencies to create an enabling environment where they can either create a necessary infrastructure which has an integrated water and sewage network. I understand the cost of integrated water and sewage network is so high that many times national government try to shrug off their responsibility. And in recent years, many cities have come up in Indonesia, India, and Ghana, and also in other countries with the so-called smart city, creative city, knowledge city concepts, and so on. And they're trying to promote 24/7 water supply when there is not even enough water to supply for 24 hours in a day. And given this, I think we need a very innovative mechanism for promoting integrated water and sewage network. I understand there are many technological advancements that is being done, but these advancements are not translated into practice or not being institutionalized into practice. And that's where the concern is being there. And second area, which many of the national international agencies ignore or doesn't want to touch upon, is the legislation and institutional arrangements to implement and regulate water supply, sanitation, and hygiene. And if you see the 2010 Overseas Economic Cooperation Development data, about 80% of the money allocated for water wash is primarily for technical improvement. And there is less on the capacity building or institutional strengthening or institutional capacity. And the third area for enabling environment is the institutional arrangement itself to facilitate community-led initiatives. There are a number of NGO-led initiatives which are very nice, significant initiatives for a short period of time, but to sustain them, there are less support from the national and international agencies, which fail to facilitate them over a long period of time. And given this, it is important at this stage at this World Toilet Day celebration. Even I don't like the word toilet because it has to be sanitation in a broader sense and hygiene in a broader sense, which leads to secure public health. And in this kind of scenario, it is important for national and international agencies to stop blaming the community, stop victimizing the community for not having enough toilets, not having adequate drinking water, and not being properly, adequately hygiene, to become an enabling institution, create an enabling institution whereby adequate infrastructure is created for community, individuals and community to build toilets on their own and to provide water supply and hygiene, to maintain adequate water supply and hygiene. Thank you.
Well, excellent. That's a really great presentation. I really enjoy the way that you sort of are able to frame the question around not just being a question of sanitation, but also of hygiene and how the two are linked, but how the state needs to build a demand into there and treat the questions of sanitation almost as a public health prescription type question, rather than just as a how do we achieve a certain goal, you know, as you might see with like the Sustainable Development Goals or something, just to hit a target. So I thought that presentation was really great, and I thought it gave us another way to kind of think about the question of sanitation, not just as a sort of end in and of itself that we know is being really important, but also as having some key linkages to other issues that are really important to us today.
Thank you.
Yeah, good. Yeah, thank you. Okay, we're going to go on to our next presenter, Freya Mills. There you go. Freya, yeah, there you go.
Wonderful. And you can see the presentation?
Mm-hmm. Yes, looks great.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to share a bit of my experience of urban sanitation in Southeast Asia, and in particular about how it aligns with the SDGs and and in particular this question of today's World Toilet Day, or yesterday's World Toilet Day, it's actually, I agree with the previous speaker that it's not just about toilets, but this World Toilet Day has recognised that, and the theme is wastewater, and so it's all about where does our poo go. And some very pretty diagrams to maybe paint a nicer picture than what's really going on. So just a summary, I'll present a bit about why this is an important topic and why we're needing to think a bit more than just the toilets. Share some findings from recent work in Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia, Vietnam and Philippines, looking in particular across the service chain and in each aspect some of the key challenges in these countries and also some of the tools for improvement. And some key ideas to move forward, and probably touching already on some of the topics that the others have spoken about. So looking across the service chain, safely managed sanitation doesn't just consider the toilet and access to the toilet, it needs to consider where does the waste go all the way across the sanitation chain. So from the user interface in the toilet, the containment, either a septic tank or pit latrine, how that's then emptied and taken to the treatment, or in the case of sewage, how it's conveyed in pipes or drains, the treatment processes, and then where it ends up, where it's disposed or reused. But as we can see by the bottom row of pictures, it's looking a bit different to the very nice graphics from UN Water about where we're hoping it goes. And we've got various issues, particularly in Southeast Asia, that's a water-based sanitation system. Many of the toilets are actually discharging to drains. Septic tanks and containments are called septic tanks, but not exactly what they are in reality, or as we design them to be. Emptying, there's various challenges with emptying. It's hard to tell in this picture, but with higher water levels, it's quite a challenge. Discharge is not always making it to treatment, and then the treatment might be placed in the treatment plant, but whether that's actually considered as safe treatment, and safe treatment in regards to the exposure risks and the downstream use or reuse of it needs to be considered. So we've got a very nice picture up top of where we're aiming for, and we've got a few steps to achieve that. This is a shit flow diagram, or fecal waste flow diagram from Hanoi, which is a really good way of seeing how the current status of the city is at achieving the safely managed sanitation across the service chain. This tool is currently available on the Susanna website, listed on the bottom, and can be created based on either desktop data or also some interviews for each city, and it's been a very effective tool in showing actually where is our waste going. Often sanitation in urban areas is quite often focused on do we have a sewage treatment plant and that aspect, but I think the shit flow diagrams helped highlight that on-site sanitation is a very important component. So from the sludge and the effluent from septic tanks and pit latrines also needs to be considered. And in doing a shit flow diagram and the analysis that goes into it, we can often see that actually a large proportion of the city's waste is in the on-site sanitation, and that's often not making it to treatment. So this diagram with the green arrows is what we're aiming for. We're wanting them to go all the way across to the right to end use and disposal, safe end use and disposal. But as we can see with the red arrows, many of them are not safe and discharging at various points into the environment. Some of the challenges of impacts of discharging into the environment are health, environmental pollution, and also economic cost of sanitation. In particular, the health, where in shifting from just looking at access to toilets to looking at the whole sanitation service chain, recent publications and health research has found that it's not just our personal sanitation improvement and sanitation access that impacts health outcomes. It's what our neighbours are doing and what the community's coverage of sanitation is as to whether we're impacted by diarrhoea, soil transmitted illness and other diseases. So this is the Sustainable Development Goals, and the recently released JMP report has detailed the next rung of the ladder that we're aiming for in the SDGs as opposed to the MDGs. So this is safely managed sanitation, which is what I'm talking about today. And it takes the next step further of ensuring that not just access to facilities, but the excreta and wastewater is safely disposed either in situ or transported and treated off-site. This can be achieved in many ways, and some of the definitions are still being developed. But the first round of reporting also, I think, highlighted that one, we need to collect a lot more data, and two, also we've got a bit of a way to go to achieve this safely managed sanitation. But it is an important next step from the basic level of sanitation. So I'll just give a bit of a summary here of the recent work that I've undertaken with various Institute for Sustainable Futures in Sydney, SNB, World Bank and IFC in these countries. And I guess one of the focuses in these areas is that we're really at this stage the JMP didn't have any data on their safely managed sanitation, and all of these cities there was only data. It's hard to say if it's only data or if there was too little percentage of safely managed. But as we can see, these countries all have quite a good rate of basic sanitation, but there is still the prevalence of limited, unimproved and open defecation. And sorry, I should have put a title. This is for urban areas only, with a lower rate in rural areas. So just as I'll go through the sanitation chain, I'll just have a bit of a summary about the status in these areas and some tools or examples of progress that's happening. So containment, so this is, as I mentioned earlier, whether it's the septic tank, pit latrine or connection to sewer. In Southeast Asia, these cities are predominantly on-site sanitation, as can be seen here. There's very few sewage connections at this stage in the Philippines and Vietnam and Indonesia. Additionally, in comparison with some African cities in these countries, it's predominantly water-based, so poor flush and latrines. The challenges that we've found is that many of the septic tanks are not actually a septic tank when you look underground or open them up and see that they're made of wood or stones, and often leaking into the ground, which is particularly in Indonesia or areas with high groundwater table. We found many of the household private wells have high contamination of E. coli, particularly in urban areas where the septic tank is often less than 10 metres from the well. Another challenge is the need to consider the effluent. This is often forgotten in septic tanks as we focus on the fecal sludge, but the effluent that discharges from a septic tank still contains high concentrations of pathogens that are definitely not removed in the process and should either be treated in a soak pit or discharged into a sewer, and this is now considered in the ship flow diagrams as a not safely contained if your septic tank is discharging to a drain. And as was just previously spoken about, one of the big challenges in improving in particular is the limited space, and also for many of the low-income houses that are renting, it's the land ownership issues to actually build something or improve something as a challenge. Some of the key positive aspects and ways that we've found that are progressing. In Indonesia, the government's recently started an output-based aid linked to improving on-site sanitation, linked with improvements and financial support to fecal sludge management. So maybe providing some septage emptying trucks if the city achieves a certain number of improved on-site sanitation systems. There's also various innovations regarding septic tanks for small areas, ranging from very small portable toilets. I think there's a few examples in Ghana from the Clean team, and then others from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's Reinvent the Toilet Challenge. But there is really a lot more that needs to be done to figure out how we're going to improve a lot of the toilets septic tanks and on-site systems that are in place, because a lot of the focus goes on to new systems. But what do we do with all of these systems that are often under the house? How do we improve them? There's still a bit of a knowledge gap. But key useful tools in this area is a lot of the data collection to actually know where we're starting at in order to make progress and in order to figure out what the demand is moving forward. And as I just showed before, the ship flow diagram to really identify what proportion we have of on-site and off-site and where's that going. emptying is the next stage of fecal sludge management, and there's, in particular in Southeast Asia, in particular in comparison with Africa, there's various challenges with emptying the wet pit latrines. But at the same time, there's a number of service providers that often exist already. Typically, many times it's manual private emptiers. As you can see on the right, there's a big pole. You can see that in many cities around the world of all of the private operators with often informal emptying services. But in many countries, it's also government. There's private people emptying it manually by hand, and there's also trucks and pumps and various other devices. But we're needing to make quite a bit of progress, because a lot of the time it's very difficult to safely access any dense urban areas. Say the truck we can see here, it has a very difficult time trying to enter any of the narrow streets that we find typically in Southeast Asia. Then the cost of transport, of then taking that in the traffic jam all the way to the treatment plant that might be located far out of town. We can see often with the private emptiers, the consideration of health and safety aspects are limited. And particularly in Vietnam and Indonesia, we found very low rates of demand for emptying, where in some African cities it's reported high emptying demand, and because the pits are filling up quickly, often with the addition of solid waste. But these wet pit latrines and septic tanks in Indonesia and Vietnam are very rarely emptied, with people often not knowing that it's a requirement or need to empty. But there has been quite significant process, particularly Indonesia and Philippines are moving forward with scheduled desludging, so having a planned and efficient service to encourage households to empty more regularly. Formalisation and improving private sector services, and also alternative ways to empty tanks, so different pump types, different service models of having smaller trucks discharging to a transfer station to make it a bit more efficient. There's a lot of work going on in this area, and there's various management toolkits. So the USAID has a costing toolkit. There's various reports on the lessons learned of developing desludging, scheduled desludging, and various other online toolkits, as well as a FSN conference happening every 2 years. Sewage is another form of containment and conveyance, and there's various issues in Southeast Asia, even though we saw that there's only a small percentage of these households that are connected. There's also a greater percentage of treatment that is available, and just a challenge of getting more households connected. Some of the challenges include the density again, the high cost of sewage systems, which often results in a treatment plant being built, but the connection of households and the sewer being left to the local government, which often doesn't happen, or happens at a slower rate, because it is quite complex due to flat terrain, high groundwater table, various other issues. Some successful stories in Indonesia have been the DFAT output-based aid, helping local governments to increasing connections to these existing networks. Community scale treatment, so decentralized systems able to serve sort of 50 households with a lower quality treatment system, but able to access more and more areas, which can then be connected into a centralized sewage system in the future. Solids-free sewage, which connects to the septic tank and allows for flatter grades of pipes and less deep. Also, there was some success in Bali of tunnelling the pipes in busy areas to reduce some of the impact. Treatment and reuse, as we can see from the presentation, the graph on the right, in Indonesia and Vietnam, a report by the World Bank found that while there is a high number of septic tanks and also some sewage, the actual amount of wastewater and septic treated is very low. There's a challenge with, particularly in Indonesia, that many of the fecal sludge treatment plants were built before the service for emptying was developed, and therefore a lot of these stopped functioning because without sufficient flows, they were oversized and didn't continue to work. Additionally, the utilization is low. Some of the treatment targets, particularly in Vietnam, are quite strict. So to achieve a treatment requires a significant investment. And often these investments in higher technologies might be mismatched with what's the capacity of the local wastewater authority to operate it, or even the electricity supply as well is often a mismatch. Moving forward, there's important consideration of modular designs to make sure that the sizing of treatment is matched with what the current demand is. And with regards to reuse, there's sort of two key areas of reuse. There's either the intentional reuse of people recognising the resource of treated waste and excreta and using that in agriculture, but a large proportion of reuse is actually all of the untreated wastewater in drains and waterways that is actually just being used as for irrigation that is polluted. So there are sort of two ways that we're needing to care about improving wastewater treatment and reuse is both those that are sort of intentionally and knowingly using the waste, and also those that are using the local canal that is polluted. And an important step for this is a multi-barrier approach, which is well outlined in the WHO's sanitation safety planning. So moving forward, some of the key considerations with all of these various challenges is that there are complex decisions and that local data is really important to base conditions and improvements on what exists, and really to focus on solutions and the service chain rather than just looking at technologies. Not one size fits all, and evidence should be informing policies, and where possible to build upon what's already in place and doing well. If there's an existing private sector that's profitable and making and having a good service, then it's worthwhile to see how we can improve that service rather than developing a new one. As was mentioned earlier about inequalities in gender, there's various aspects of leaving no one behind. We must ensure that while we look at citywide services, we might need to prioritise some specific groups. In particular, a challenge in urban areas is the rental market and the households, either in informal settlements or rental that don't actually own the land, and the challenges that they face in improving their sanitation. As we progress and include the private sector and others, we need to improve enforcement to ensure that the services are achieving a safe level, but at the same time encourage more participation in the sector, because we've got a long way to go. And one of the larger, most important aspects is looking at urban sanitation in the whole city. So a citywide context for both the planning to ensure fecal sludge management and wastewater is included at the same time in both the long-term planning and also in the government. The roles and responsibilities are at this time often separated for wastewater and fecal sludge. So that's a bit of a detailed review of the various challenges in Southeast Asia and some of the tools that we can look towards and develop further to progress and to make sure that when we look at where does the poo go, it actually makes it to the very end of the service chain. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for that presentation. I thought that was really helpful, and I like how it sort of continues a progression here so far we've had of getting, I feel like, a little more technical, a little bit more practitioner-based, and it really was helpful, I think, also for a lot of people who maybe work or live in countries and places where, you know, sanitation is very much just we have a flush toilet, you know, you hit the button and it goes away and you just never think about it again. And so this was able to show that there's a lot of people, the majority of the world's population, who have a much more tangible, much more hands-on experience with the poo. And I think that'll tie in nicely to some of the questions that have already been coming in regarding groundwater contamination and septic and how we can sort of separate the two. I'd like to remind everyone who's tuning in first that all the presentations will be made available on our website, www.iwra.org, after the presentation. Give us a day or two, and also that if you have any questions, you can go ahead and direct them to us here at any time you want. Just go right to the control panel. You'll see that there's a question section. Just type it in and I'll see it, and then I'll direct it to the appropriate person at the end of the presentation. We'll be going now to our next presentation. Professor Oberg, the floor is yours. can't hear you. You'll need to turn the muting off. Here, let's see if we can. We'll get you. That's let's see. Usually it would let me turn your microphone back on manually over here, but it's not giving me that option right now. Okay, no, I see that you can't do anything. It's not your. Don't worry about it. We'll work it out. Tell you what, Sonia, could we ask you to present, and then we'll work out the microphone situation with Professor Oberg? Would that work?
Yes, I can do that.
Awesome. Thank you. I can hear you. Let's make you presenter, and we will catch up with Professor Oberg. Voice and audio, voice and video later.
Does that look okay?
Looks great. Can we see your screen?
Can you see it?
No, we do not.
Okay. I hit share screen and I've got it.
Yep, there it is. Maybe it's just a little slow.
Okay.
There's tubes.
Okay, well, thanks to everyone who's tuning in, and thanks again to Scott for coordinating this and also providing that introduction that he did earlier. Again, my name is Sonia Loy. I'm a student at Texas A&M University, about to finish up in my master's program, and I'm a part of the Texas A&M Water, Energy, Food Nexus Initiative, and I say that to let you know that that will kind of shape my perspective and my presentation and some of the points that I'm making. And so my presentation is focusing a little bit away from the human health impacts, which are incredibly important, but my research has been looking at using treated wastewater on for irrigation on agriculture fields and how that's actually affecting the soil health in terms of its productivity with relation to water use, water management, and available water to the plants. And so my research site is in a town in West Texas, and so I'll be also discussing some of the implications of looking at this in terms of decision making and policy, and also farmer irrigation management and frequency and how much water he uses. And so from that, the big question that I'm looking at in my research is, does the use of treated wastewater degrade the soil's ability to hold water for plants? And just to clarify, the level of treated wastewater that we're looking at here is a secondary treated level, and that's really how my lit review and what I've been looking at has been narrowed down to. And so the big question there is using treated wastewater in the long run causing us to use more water for irrigation because the soil can hold less of it for the plants? Because it seems like a great idea because we're conserving water by reusing the water, but is it affecting our soil in such a way that in the long run isn't great? And so to provide some perspective, I've been looking at a lot of the literature and other examples, and with this level of treatment, and this is not a comprehensive or exhaustive map, but a lot of the other examples are concentrated in the Mediterranean region, North Africa, the Middle East, and then you see, I've actually seen a lot of literature come out of Brazil, and then looking at this kind of Western United States and arid and semi-arid regions that have been looking at using treated wastewater for irrigation as a water conservation practice. And really, the really interesting thing that I've been finding is that the literature does not concur that there's not a definitive treated wastewater is good or bad or neutral, but it's different. And the take-home message there is that the soil characteristics, the climate, and the water quality play a pretty important role in whether it's suitable for your region to use treated wastewater as a alternative to using groundwater or surface water. And so going back to, zooming in on this map of Texas, this map shows us water wells that are drawn for different water uses. And so these green dots are looking at water for agriculture, the red is water for energy, and the blue is water for municipalities. And the place that I'll show you in a map later, but the place that we're looking at is kind of in the west central Texas area where you see a lot of red, blue, and green, and you have this competition for water, energy, and food in cities for the water sources, and when you get in those West Texas towns, you'd know that they're pretty dry, and they don't have a lot of surface water, and so a lot of them are drawing from these groundwater sources. And so what are we looking at when we talk about soil health regarding treated wastewater? And again, this is an exhaustive list, but this is what I've been looking at. The big parameters that you look at are pH, how it's affecting the acidity of the soil. Salinity and sodicity are pretty big concerns with treated wastewater. The suspended solids that are coming from the treated wastewater and organic matter, and then the resulting microbial activity in the soil, heavy metals uptake that's coming from the treated wastewater. I didn't put this here, but another emerging concern is pharmaceuticals and nanoparticles and some emerging contaminants that we don't really know what they're doing to the soil. And I'll talk a little bit later about the lab that I've run all my samples through and what I work in and what we look at in terms of soil water holding capacity. And so all of these, the main thing that I'm looking at is that the water holding properties of the soil. And my big point of looking at this is the fact that we believe that soil is at the nexus of the connection of water and food, because the soil is holding the water that the plants are using. And so some potential effects of using treated wastewater on the soil water holding properties are the suspended solids that are coming in, clogging up the pores and making less space available for the water. Is the salinity or sodicity or the organic matter affecting the dispersion of the clays, which reduces infiltration so that the water can't travel down through the profile of the plant or of the soil? And then all of that culminating into the parameter that I'm looking at is the available water to plants reduced as a result of treated wastewater? And again, I won't get too technical into the soil science of it, but I will mention some things regarding that. And like I said, the literature doesn't concur on, there are some that say the pH is increased or decreased, some say that salinity is neutral or increased or decreased, but it all depends on the soil, the climate, and the water quality that you're looking at. And so looking at the specific case study of Texas, the Texas Commission for Environmental Quality is our governing body for environmental standards here in Texas, and we have 2 designations for reclaimed water that can be used for irrigation. Type 1 is a higher quality of water that's below drinking water standard, but it is with the consideration that humans are likely to contact the irrigation area, and that you can use this water that will be going to food crops that humans will eat. And then you have a type 2 water, which is less stringent, less likely for humans to contact, and you can use this for non-food or for feed for animal crops. And so what we're looking at is a type 2 reclaimed water, because the farm that I'm looking at is a cotton farm, and so this isn't going to feed. And so you can see the parameters are based on organic matter and potential bacterial pathogens that could be in the water, but that's all that is regulating this water use. And so a question here is, are these quality parameters sufficient when you're considering an overall sustainability goal for environmental, economic, and social sustainability? And so we'll come back to this, but looking at our case study, we have a farm in San Angelo. He's growing cotton. He has a drip irrigation system. He applies a standard tillage, 6 to 8 inches of tillage before each planting season, and he has 3 fields. One field you see here at the bottom right is his treated wastewater field, which is coming from a canal, which is coming from the municipality. And I'll talk a little bit about what kind of treatment they're using. You have these fields here in the middle left, which are groundwater, which he's pulling from an underlying aquifer, which is actually brackish groundwater. It's slightly saline, and so he prefers to use the treated wastewater because he thinks the groundwater isn't as good. It produces a little lower yields for him, and then he has his fields on the north end, which are just rain-fed and dry land, and so that can serve as our control site. And so this is where I pulled my samples from. And then we have this FF, which stands for filter flush. And on this site, he applies a disc filtration to the treated wastewater, and this FF is where he's discharging the backflow from that. And so for us, that serves as a sample for a lot of the suspended solids are actually going to this filter flush area, and he just back flushes it. He's not actually growing in that spot, but it was a great a great sampling item so that we could compare that to the treated wastewater as well to see kind of an accelerated effect of the treated wastewater. And so, like I said, we have the treated wastewater plant, which is applying an aerobic biological treatment with 2 iterations of clarification, and then it goes into these canals, which are right here on the bottom left, and then it's going through a disc filtration system that the farmer has applied on site. And so the question here is this system sufficient in terms of filtration and treatment for the farmer to use on his field in the long run? And he's been using this treated wastewater for about 15 years. So it's considering it a long-term study. And like I said, the soil type is important, and so the soil that we're looking here is very high in clays. Texas is famous for its high clay content soils. We looked at a particle size distribution, and it has between 40 and 50% clay content in all the horizons. This also derives from a limestone parent material, and so it's very calcareous, has a lot of calcium carbonates in it. And then we looked at up to the 72 centimeter depth in 3 different horizons. We had our plowed horizon, we have a lower A horizon, and a lower B horizon. And as I mentioned, we have our control with the rain-fed, treated wastewater and filter flush, and then a brackish groundwater irrigation. And so this is where it gets a little bit technical, so I won't go into this too much, but basically we're building upon and applying a new method in quantifying water holding properties of soil that's based on the pedostructure concept and then the resulting hydrostructural properties of soil. And the main point from this slide is that we're looking at soil as a hierarchical structure in that water can be held in the soil within the macropore and the micropore, which are 2 pore systems and areas. And as the soil dries, you can see it's drying from the macropore and then into the micropore, and then there's no water left. And that's what this bottom soil shrinkage curve is showing us. If you go from right to left, you're seeing it as it's drying, as the volume's decreasing, and you see A, B, C, D, E, F, G, or E, F are points on the curve that we're able to extract with this new method that applies new thermodynamic equations to this curve. And the water retention curve, which is also going to be considered. And so we extracted these parameters using a new device called the type of soil, and the one we have at Texas A&M is actually the only functioning lab in the US. And so what it does is it measures from saturation to dry, mass volume, and water retention, and outputs a water retention curve and a soil shrinkage curve. So as I said, we can analyze on a very quantitative basis those points at which the macropore and the micropore space are changing. And so that gets into what are the properties that I'm actually looking at, and that's field capacity, permanent wilting point, and the resulting available water capacity, which is the difference between the field capacity and the permanent wilting point. And in terms of agronomic applications, these are very standard points that you're looking at in the water soil matrix. What isn't in the past is not a lot of agreement on is what exactly is the quantitative point that these should be extracted from. And so this methodology applies that the field capacity is where the water starts being drawn from that micropore space. And so you see this blue line is the micropore water, so the max change in slope in that is where it's starting to pull from that. And then the residual water is this red line, and I'm trying not to get too technical, but it's down here. This point B is where the residual water starts, and so the theory there is when it gets to that point, the plant can no longer pull from the soil. And so you can see this max change in slope graph right here. And if you have more questions about this, I'd love to talk to you more, but I'm not going to get too much into it because I'm also out of time right now. And so the results that we found, we had different responses with the surface versus the subhorizons, which was consistent with the literature. And it makes sense because the top horizon is tilled, it's not well aggregated, the soil structure is on a yearly basis disturbed, and so you don't have a well aggregated pore space for the soil to hold on to. And so what we actually saw was an increase in field capacity and in available water in the treated wastewater, and then even more in the filter flush, which makes sense because the filter flush is an accelerated example of the treated wastewater irrigation. And that could probably be attributed to organic matter increasing in this top horizon, which the soil will hold on to this organic matter, and so that organic matter probably wouldn't be traveling into the lower horizons. And it's theorized in soil science that an increase in organic matter actually increases the water retention of the soil, and so that makes sense. And then you see in the subhorizons, which is the larger part of the root zone, 15 to 72 centimeters, actually a decrease in the water holding properties of the soil. But you also see an interesting response it's the same with the groundwater and the treated wastewater, that they're both slightly decreased. So what I did, these top graphs are on a per kilogram basis. It's kind of a capacity of the soil numbers, but what I wanted to look at was on a more field scale, looking at per acre, according to the root depth, how is this affecting his water irrigation. And so this bottom line of this table is really what's relevant here, and looking at the rain-fed has a higher water holding capacity in all situations, but the rain-fed is yielding much less for the farmer, and so they're going to irrigate. And so looking at wastewater versus groundwater irrigation, and then considering the statistical significance, which I used a 95% confidence, is that you actually don't see a big difference in water use per yield, per bale of cotton produced, in all cases except for the AP horizon. You just see that there's more available water per yield, but in the A and B horizon, they're pretty much the same. The difference is negligible. And so the overall conclusion from what our findings are is that using the treated wastewater is actually no worse than using the brackish groundwater. We can't say that it's better, but we can say that it is a suitable alternative to drawing from that aquifer that they're actually sharing with 8 other farming counties. And like I said, he prefers to use it because he thinks he gets more yield out of it, but in terms of a water use scenario in the long run, it's actually about the same as the treated wastewater. But just to bring it back home to the idea that decision makers and people who are making regulations and kind of setting the quantities for these different areas of kind of soil quality indicators, or whether they should reuse their treated wastewater, they should really understand that their region is going to be different from other regions, and if they're looking at studies that say treated wastewater use is good, bad, or neutral, they should really consider the type of soil, its texture, the climate of the region, the water quality that they're using, and what the relationship of all of that is. So yeah, that is my presentation. Thanks again for listening, and sorry I went a couple minutes over.
No, it's no problem at all. Good. Thank you so much for that great presentation. It looks like you were out there in Texas Hill Country, yeah?
No, we're actually we were in the flat West Texas terrain, but we had to drive through the hill country to get there.
It's beautiful out there. It's good. It's good to always have something beautiful for your field site. But I also thought it was really informative, and as we increasingly looked at ways to handle our wastewater and ways to handle agricultural issues, which uses the majority of the world's water, then it's important to be able to kind of tie the two together and look for ways that we can sort of bring synergy together, but at the same time be attentive to concerns like you raised. I mean, to make sure that this is going to work out fine. I'd like to speak more about this, but I know Professor Oberg has to go in 15 minutes, and so I do want to turn the floor over to her now that she can speak to us. So,
thank you.
Professor Oberg, I'm going to quickly make you the presenter, and sorry for the technical hold-up earlier.
Well, thank you. See if I can get my PowerPoint on here. There, you see my PowerPoint?
Looks great.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me, Scott, to this seminar, or this webinar. I will be focusing on rapidly growing urban areas. And as you all probably know, more than 50% of the world population do now live in urban areas. And the numbers are rapidly increasing. Large portion of the urban population live in informal settlements. We can call them favelas, villas, slum, whatever they're called. They're all in common, that what they have in common is that they are underserviced when it comes to services that many of us take for granted, such as electricity, water, sanitation, streetlights, postal services, etc. Also, they often are located on old garbage dumps, between train tracks, on locations that easily get inundated or at risk for landslides, which make it even more complicated to provide these services. People are often poor and the health risks are high. The lack of clean water, we know that's a major contributor, and many governments have pleaded to provide water to all. Buenos Aires, Argentina, for example, almost 100% of the inhabitants also in the villas, so the slums, have access to running water. Well, the thing is that one of the first things that people get when they're provided with running water is a toilet. This would be great if it wasn't for the fact that the rest of the system is lacking. And at times, or very often in education, engineering education, and when we talk about these kind of areas, similarities are pulled to the situation in London, in the 19th century London, which most probably are familiar with. In short, the water toilets were becoming increasingly common. The contents were flushed out on the streets, leading to cholera outbreaks. The solution was to hook the toilets to the rainwater sewers and then build larger sewers along the Thames to lead the digesta away from the people. And within a few decades, the cholera was more or less eradicated. The introduction of the sanitary sewer system is one of the main reasons why Europe and North America was transformed from poverty-stricken, haunted by poor health and high child mortality, to wealthy and healthy populations. And it's commonly assumed that the very same model will have the same impact in the rest of the world. Not everybody agrees, though. Now and then, critical voices are raised, claiming that the conventional system simply won't cut it, as it's too expensive and too inflexible, and that the comparison with London is misguided. Together with some colleagues, we set out to look at this claim. And here's a graph over fast-growing urban areas in the world. It's based on data from the World Bank. We grouped them in 3 groups. We have taken cities between 300,000 and 5 million, between 5 million and 10 million, and places larger than 10 million. And we're showing in this graph 20 in each of these groups, in these categories. If we go back to London, during its most rapid growth phase, which was between 1851 and 71, it did approach about 3%. But for the rest of the time, it fluctuated around 1%. At that rate, it took London about 50 years to double its population to 2 million. As you can see in this graph, we have a large number of urban areas with a growth rate well above 4%. And if we include cities that are around 100%, we have a number that actually are higher, approaching 10%. And in the 19th century London was the only city with more than 1 million inhabitants. Today, there are more than 500 cities with more than 1 million inhabitants. And there's at least 15 cities with over 20 million inhabitants. For example, Lagos in Nigeria has a growing rate of about 4%. That means that they add about 1 million people every year. And most of these people are coming to these under-serviced areas. So let's take a closer look at Lagos. This is again from the UN. The population in Lagos was 13.7 million in 2016, according to their estimates. And it's estimated to grow to 24 million by 2030. The number of people without safe sanitation, oh, the wrong way, was estimated to be 9.7 in 2016, about 65% of the population. If we assume that Lagos doesn't build out their sewer system and all the newcomers, plus the newborns, etc., are not getting sanitation, the number of people who don't have safe sanitation would increase about 20 million by 2030, or about 80% of the population. If the goal was to provide everybody with sanitation by 2030, we would have to have a build-out rate of about 125,000 individuals per month. This is if we were to set out to provide sanitation to both the ones who right now don't have sanitation and the newcomers. So 125,000 individuals per month, is that a lot? Is that realistic? Could we do that? To figure that out, we set out to find information on build-out times for sanitary systems. The data in this table is from the World Bank, and as if you can see, the most projects proceed at the rate far below 1,000 individuals per month. A few are higher. If we assume that Lagos would be able to keep the highest rate observed in the World Bank data record, which is 1,800 individuals per month, and we plot that in the very same diagram, that is the triangles you see in this diagram. And as you can see, that's barely distinguishable from the do-nothing scenario. I think it's quite safe to say that the conventional model simply doesn't cut it. Over the past 5 years or so, I've been visiting a number of water and sanitation conferences, and there's generally somebody pointing this out. The conventional system with the toilet, the sewer, and the treatment plant is simply too expensive and too inflexible, and we can't do it. Someone who enthusiastically tries to initiate a discussion about alternatives. And there is no doubt a growing interest for resource recovery. But the problem is that 90% of research and development goes to solutions that requires a functioning sewer system. And meanwhile, at least 90% or more of the underserviced urban population live in areas where there are no sewer systems, and most likely there never will be, because it simply is too expensive and too inflexible. As I mentioned earlier, and as was mentioned by at least 2 of the previous speakers, many of these underserviced areas are in locations where there's high inundation, landslides, etc. And it's extremely complicated and expensive to put in sewer systems. And sewer systems are also, the sewers are also the most expensive part when it comes to maintenance and operation. It's not the treatment plants. I've observed that when the toilet to sewer to treatment facility modeled is questioned on these conferences, it's generally met with a fatherly pat on the head. And that's nice, but it's impossible. And we know that this works. It worked in Europe and in North America, therefore it should work here. And what else would we be doing? I find this quite interesting. In other fields, other research fields, not knowing what to do is a driver of innovation and research. So, is it utopian to believe that we actually can evoke innovation and research beyond the end-of-pipe linear model, even when it comes to dealing with digesta, or shit, or poo, or whatever you want to call it? That went faster than I thought, but we are now done. Thank you, and I would like to also thank the people that I've been working with, in particular Genevieve Madsen and Yusuke Kuyama and Stephen Conrad, who have been helping me with the details behind this presentation.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that presentation. I thought that was really helpful and kind of gave us a bit of background and sort of framed some of the issues at the end of for us. Sort of, I feel like kind of maybe give us a sort of an overview summary of the directions that we were going. So I think it was really helped to kind of summarize the conversation for us. We have just a few minutes for presentations, and I know that Professor Oberg, you have a tight deadline, so you need to go. So if you need to log off, go ahead, and I understand. But if we can have a couple questions from the rest of the panel, it'd be great. You know, one of the questions that has come up here is that you know, what is the connection for in a lot of developing countries situations, and this is how, you know, this is phrased from our person who's attending. The central sewage is there is no central system, as Professor Oberg was saying. It just isn't going to work. And so if people using septic tanks and other systems like this that are really close to surface water, you know, what are all the ways that being able to separate these systems that are like septic tanks that are close to surface water, groundwater that is being used by the population, what are some ways to mitigate these problems? And you can just sort of reference back to your presentations, you know, and sort of summarize that maybe for our person who's attending.
Well,
anyone can jump in.
yeah, I can jump in shortly. I'm definitely not a specialist in that field, and as I said, I've been contributing and participating in a number of conferences and listening to people. And there's a number of very interesting innovative approaches that are a combination of centralized and decentralized solutions, where you're trying to close the loop on the local plane, but perhaps have monitoring on a larger scale. And of course, the Gates Foundation's initiatives. My fear is, tying back to Sarah Vanan's presentation, is that many of these are also focusing primarily on the technology. It is very much an engineering problem, but it has to be combined with the local environment. That's been said since the 60s. But bring in the social and cultural and political aspects, and I think very much the solid governance structure is one of the most important parts. And that if there isn't a solid governance structure, it won't work. I will have to beg off now, and thank you for inviting me. I have to run as one of my doctoral students will be defending their thesis, and I think it would be very happy if I didn't show up. So thank you very much for inviting me. Bye.
Thank you for coming. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that question?
I guess I'll add a few comments as well, and that's it's an ongoing challenge, and also something that we're quite uncertain as well. The groundwater conditions in each country really, and each city within a city varies considerably. So even trying to give a standard of, oh, you should allow X distance separation from a pit latrine to a well, or Y vertical distance separation, it's quite dependent on the local groundwater conditions, ground conditions, and seasonally. But a big challenge is that the septic tanks at this stage are often not sealed, and is there any way that we can be sealing these septic tanks? Which, when I consider a lot of the urban areas that I've visited in Southeast Asia, to access a tank that's under a house and to reseal it, it would be very expensive and a challenge. So I think that's a definite area of research that we need to, how do we improve our current septic tanks, particularly with the comments from Professor Oberg that it's difficult to achieve sewage. Another alternative is to look at what can we do in sort of small or low-cost sewage options. So are there ways to optimise what we're designing for sewage to make it cheaper, and needing to remember that often we design a sewer based on developed countries' water use, and also the thought that both black water from the toilet and also grey water from the kitchen are going into it, but often they're going into separate locations. So maybe we have opportunities to reduce the cost, but I feel that at this stage this is a big area that needs further research. So I'm also with the participants and watching this presentation that's a key question. So if anyone else has other comments, that would be great.
Well, I think there's kind of a last question here. I mean, we're at the limit of our time, and I know there's a few other kind of very specific questions that people have been posing, but if they're very specific for one of our presenters, go ahead and feel free to follow up with them directly. If it's a localized geographic area specialization or something that that you need to follow up and ask them, go ahead. I'm sure they'll write you back. But maybe we can just have a kind of a summary from each and everybody, and sort of responding to this question, which is to what extent have the intentions of World Toilet Day been successful? So you can sort of reflect both on how you've come to know about World Toilet Day, and not just me sending you an email saying please present for me, but how have your own work been reflected in getting kind of solutions to the problems that you see? So maybe we could just kind of go around. Everyone can take a turn.
I can go ahead and chime in on that. In looking at my own journey in getting into this field, and I know what I've been looking at is on a lot more of the technical sense, but in some of my research I've also looked at possibility of separating gray water and how that also affects the soil, and talking to just other people that I know that people don't know about a lot of where their water is going. And so really, I think what World Toilet Day does a good job of, and me just telling my friends about World Toilet Day, they're, well, why is that a thing? And then you get to spark a conversation about, well, the way our system works is this way, but in areas around the world it's very different, and most people actually don't have this. And in terms of a place where our wastewater can go, and then it's a one line in, one line out where I am, but what are the conversations we can be having to look at these potential solutions that we're asking in terms of on a global scale, making sure that everyone gets clean and safe water in the right amounts. And if more people are in on the conversation, we have more brains thinking about it.
If I can jump in, this, Scott, I think the World Toilet Day has really created awareness among the people, especially in remote areas. You know, that is something very significant. That is the purpose of this World Toilet Day or any other days that UN tries to do. But it has not been supported with equal commitment from national and international agencies. You know, this is where the problem lies. People are aware of it, at least they're thinking about it, and the rich community have been able to answer some of the discussion that we had earlier. Rich communities or rated communities have made their own arrangements for water recycling, and this is really significant. And the point that comes to some of the discussion, and also Professor Erberg's point, was that whether the government can take up the load of work of water treatment, the whole cycle of water sanitation and hygiene. I think it's difficult for the government to take whole responsibility. And if it is a richer, gated communities, if they can do it by themselves and if it can be regulated, that's well and good. At the same time, there are NGOs who have been working on this at a local scale. And I think we need to facilitate those sort of measures to be done. And where the government has to really focuses on is the really urban poor or the rural poor areas, where government can really invest and try to make a good water infrastructure in that area. And I think this is where the role of government and the international agencies need to come forward with more efforts, rather than being behind in spreading awareness or in documenting things. Thanks.
Who's next?
I'll pop in a few more comments as well. For me, one of the most beneficial aspects of this World Toilet Day has been organisations like IWRA, UN, various others, everyone getting around to share information, to raise the issue, and also to produce a lot of material specifically targeted and triggered by this day. This is going to really help practitioners, and as we move forward, to try and understand better, particularly around the aspect of the service chain and where does the waste go, for helping actually achieve the SDGs, and understanding really what does this SDG mean in comparison to the previous MDGs. So I think for me it's really beneficial that it's a way to trigger a lot of organisations and people to be finishing reports, sharing reports, and having webinars like this. So thanks again, and yep, I look forward to reading all the things that have just been published in the last few days.
Excellent, good, thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing. Can you hear me? No, I've had some problems before, but yeah, so something fascinating for me is that World Toilet Day offers such a transversal research issue. So you have people coming from all different walks of life. Last year I was able to go to the conference, to the World Toilet Conference, and there you meet engineers, researchers, physicians, human rights specialists, but people that are all concerned for one central issue, and that's to make sure that everyone has the proper sanitation to keep themselves and their communities healthy. So it's fascinating to see so many different types of people coming together for one common goal.
Well, you know, and I think that's an interesting observation, because to me that often reflects what the International Water Resources Association is kind of about. We have people who are engineers, who are lawyers, who are social scientists, all coming together with maybe a more broad picture, water, than just a specific sanitation toilet focus. But also, I mean, it's that mixing and interdisciplinary, transversal is the word I used, with, you know, perspective, and I think that's a good note to go out on. I'd like to thank everybody for joining me here on the panel. Dr. Saravan, Freya Mills, Hashka Grinsky, Sonia Lui, and Gunilla Oberg. Thank you all for taking the time out of your day to come join me and to speak to our audience and share your work with us. Just remind everybody that we're going to put these presentations on our website, www.iwra.org, pretty soon. Give us a day or two. And we're also going to have a recording of this webinar, so you can listen to it just as many times as you want. I know it's fascinating. It's worth at least 2 or 3 good listens, just so you can really get everything, all those deep thoughts. I'd also like to remind everybody that many of the panelists and IWRA itself, we're all on Twitter. So if you're interested in following along and seeing kind of people often tweet about their work and what they're doing, and follow what kind of announcements the IWRA is having, go ahead and find us on Twitter and other social media. You know, and please also take advantage of the special issue of Water International that is now open access for you. I know there's a lot of great articles in there from Dr. Saravan and others. So you can, the directions are all be mailed out to you if you're, well, you registered. Since you're here, you registered, and the follow-up email is going out to everyone who registered. So all the directions on there, and let us know if you have any problems accessing them. But please take advantage of that great offer from Taylor and Francis, our publishers, and we really like to appreciate their support and help on that. And please also follow up on our LinkedIn webpage. You can look us up, iwra.org, and keep the conversation going. If there's some questions and things you want to follow up on, we'd like to continue to have that and stay in touch with our members. I really hope that everyone here found the insights provided by the panel today for World Toilet Day and the sanitation issues that we discussed and engaged with just as fascinating as I did. It really gave me a lot of material to think about even in my own work, because I'll be writing a paper and article today later. And you know, I hope that this is generating some creativity and reflexivity on your own part, and you're able to take this away and share this with others and to incorporate this in things that you're doing. I'd just like to remind you all again that the webinar is brought to you by the International Water Resources Association. We're an over 40 years old nonprofit, non-governmental education organization, and we bridge disciplines and geographies and connect professionals, students, individuals, corporations, and institutions, everyone who's concerned with the sustainable use of the world's water resources. So if you're interested in learning more about the association, or if you want to become a member, which is a great idea, you should go to www.iwra.org. So on behalf of the whole IWRA office and everyone who's joining us, I'd like to thank you everyone for participating and attending. Thank you so much. Go off and have a great World Toilet Day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Scott. Thanks.
Thanks to everybody. Yeah.